This is the Depth Mystic Community Podcast, episode 37. So, Jungian Depth Mystic, Zach Tolan. What are we talking about this week? Well, it's been a really interesting week. And there's all sorts of things we could have a conversation about. Why don't we talk about this idea that we covered in a previous episode, but that has appeared for me again this week. And it's what we called alpha and omega. Okay, sure, yeah. Alpha and omega. I mean, the phrase comes from the book of Revelation, in which God is saying he is Alpha and Omega, the first and the last. And the book of Revelation ended up being, canonically, the last book in the Bible. And so Genesis is the first book and Revelation is the last. Yes, that's where the phrase comes from. And it's biblical association. But we talked about it in a completely different way when we had our episode on Alpha and Omega. Yeah, that's true. In my life, I've found a whole other use for the term. And I guess that's what you want me to get at. Yeah, because it's our idiosyncratic meaning of the term that came up again this week. Basically, Alpha and Omega means tremendous strength and tremendous weakness, all in the same thing. And that's how we characterize ourselves. More specifically, we have alpha consciousness and omega social status, like all in the same person. And I guess that came up again for me this week, so maybe we can talk about that. Well, yeah, sure. That's a perfectly good thing to talk about. Like the alpha consciousness is this type of experience that we barely ever find anyone else who's had it, and therefore discovered this type of consciousness, to which our mystical initiation period devoted 21 years. Like when I first discovered what I call the white light, what followed was 21 years of integrating to the point where I could relativize my understanding of what it was at the most basic level. And then once I was able to relativize it, I came back. And the old personality that had died to make room for this white light entity came back to me. So the part of me which had gone away at age 20, that original personality, it took the back seat. It receded. And this new sort of, you might call it a mentally ill personality, because when I'm first discovering the white light, it doesn't have any concept of how to adapt to the world it's in. And my whole being was taken up to discover it. Well, that's interesting when you say mentally ill, because that highlights the omega condition, the omega half of the alpha-omega split. Well, that's true. I didn't mean to get there right away, but in a way I just sort of insinuated that that's what happened, because from society's perspective, I was categorized as mentally ill, and I didn't have any way of sort of extricating myself from that general category. And so I've ended up in an omega social status. You are on disability for mental illness. Yeah, that does sound like a pretty omega social status. And that's what it took for me to faithfully absorb the energy that came upon me from age 20 through age 41. I had to sort of sacrifice all semblance of legitimacy in society, both like in terms of credentials and in terms of making a living. Thankfully, there is a category of being mentally ill which can make you a living, as it were, because they have disability money for mental illness. And this is Omega. This is Omega social status. That definitely sounds like Omega social status. I guess the real question is, do you actually also have alpha consciousness or not? Because there's lots of people on disability for mental illness. And whatever society thinks of such people, it doesn't often think much of those people because they don't have anything that calls attention to them. They don't have anything to recommend them. But for us, there's this idea of alpha consciousness. Maybe you can tell me more about the alpha consciousness. Well, yeah, my original personality died when I was 20 years old. And it opened up a space. Because I was willing to die, in a way, the space opened up. And this other world came into view. And I call that the white light. And I compare that experience to the light that blinded Paul of Tarsus on the road to Damascus. Like, in terms of the magnitude and intensity of that experience, I find the best parallel in society in Paul's experience. Okay, well, that's good that you have something to compare it to, but we don't need to talk about Paul today. I mean, we can stick to your idea of what your alpha consciousness is and feels like. Sounds good. So, I think it has something to do with a way of thinking about things that is not commonly practiced by anyone in society, but that was able to sort of bear fruit over time. I was able to see things in new ways, like being initiated, being taught the ways of the Force. It's like there is the Force, and there are the ways of the Force. And regular society doesn't acknowledge these ways. And yet, for me, they were absolute compulsion. Once I was immersed into the white light, for 21 years, I had no choice but to devote myself to learning these ways. Whether or not they end up having value in society or that other people find them admirable, I subjectively found them admirable. And I wasn't entirely in control. The end result is that I have a kind of consciousness that I think is like broader than almost anybody else's in its fundamental range. I mean, that's pretty arrogant, but I guess that is consistent with the claim of like alpha consciousness. Alpha is thought of as kind of arrogant, Many people will think of it that way. The only question that matters with regard to my mystical experience is whether or not I really do have an alpha consciousness to compensate for my utterly omega social status. That's the only question that matters. And the whole premise of our ministry is basically that the answer is yes. I'm not saying this alpha consciousness is superior to every other consciousness in every other domain. But I am saying it's superior to every other consciousness in enough domains that it's a valid reason to start a ministry. And so here I am, somebody with no social status at all, on disability for mental illness. I get money from the government, and I just live off of that. Well, yeah, I mean, I would agree. If that doesn't constitute omega social status, I don't know what is. Right. And therefore, the only real question with regard to this whole ministry is, in what way is the consciousness actually superior to anything that already exists. Okay, so now we have actually expressed what you mean by alpha and omega. We are alpha and omega. At least we claim to be. If our podcast has any reason to exist, that means we have some kind of alpha consciousness. Meaning we're saying stuff nobody else is saying, or in a way nobody else is saying it. So yeah, the continued question, is this an alpha consciousness talking? Is the ministry upon which this podcast is based something unique, something that's not quite in existence? Because if we're just something like a copy, then we're not alpha. We're like beta or gamma and omega. We have omega social status, and let's say we're beta, which is to say we're good, but we're not unique. We're not one of a kind. Then I guess it's okay. We're doing our duty, right? It's our duty to give voice to what we think, even if it's been said before. If we are so low on the totem pole socially, then it's good that we're doing something. But again, what it comes down to is, are we actually alpha and omega? Is the Depth Mystic Community podcast representing a voice that there's no other voice of that type in the world? That is the question. And I claim that it is. I claim that this thing is alpha and omega. You could say that I need to claim that in order to feel special. Like I'm not just a total failure. In other words, my conclusion is emotionally driven and not logically driven. And in the end, it's up to the person listening to decide whether they think what's being said constitutes something unique. But at least the basic claim for our podcast is that there is something alpha here. There is something more advanced than what's readily available. And it's precisely because I think I'm an alpha that I called this the Community Podcast. It's sort of like, if you really are that alone, then you need a community. Or at least you need to confess that your lack of community hurts you so much that you're just going to pretend that you have one. You have to solve that problem of belonging in one way or another. That's really interesting. You're reminding me of our origin story. Like, the issue of community was so pressing that the only way we could begin this podcast in good faith was to just call it a community. Yeah, because an alpha consciousness needs an audience. We need a cult or a following or just a dialogue. A consciousness that's unique because it's advanced needs a community of people who are talking about it. And so we're going to have a community, even if it has to be the same person turning himself into 3 people. Whatever it takes, we're going to have that community. This is the Depth Mystic Community Podcast. This is episode 37, and we could talk about more things. Well, yeah, I'm totally open to it. We could talk about Carl Jung. Well, we talk about him all the time. I don't know, when I think of depth mysticism, I mean, Carl Jung is the Yoda of depth mysticism. So maybe we could take a fresh angle on the Yoda of depth mysticism. Well, he is a genius. He is a genius. And it's a little upsetting in a way that it took such an extraordinarily talented and physically healthy and capable man to cut through all the nonsense and discover the truth about depth mysticism that really matters. Like maybe history is created by great men. But I guess the fact that it required somebody as strong and capable as Carl Jung to figure all this stuff out is a testament to just how much bullshit society puts in the way of figuring stuff like this out. The bullshit of society is so thick that only someone of Carl Jung's talent and genius could consolidate the essentials of this new depth mystic way of thinking, moving into the age of Aquarius. Because all the ideas are out there, but what you need is for someone to put them all in one place so you can realize that, oh, they are all in one place. Like this is a whole new way of looking at the world, and all the pieces fit together. Okay, so do you think that all the pieces would have ended up fitting together if Carl Jung hadn't fit them together? I don't know. I don't think so. That's what's so important sometimes about like specific great men. They sometimes are the reason that we have the history that we have. Because his philosophy is equal to the devastation of World War I and World War II. Like Jung's psychology is so profound that it's actually arguably the triumphant end product of the devastation that was World War I. That might not sound logical when you first say it, but he was growing within himself a way of seeing things that could explain the events of the 20th century and beyond in many ways. But like, history was super intense, and all these forces were colliding with each other, and eventually they come to the surface. But when they do come to the surface, is there any consciousness capable of perceiving them and catching them and transmuting them into a coherent, unified philosophy that is actually capable of transcending the moment, the historical moment? And that's why Jung is so important, because that's what he was able to do. He could experience what was happening and move ahead, transcend it. He saw far into the future. And lesser men, in many ways, are only trying to catch up with that type of accomplishment. And now in the post-Jungian world, we are blessed with Jung's accomplishment so that we can build on top of it. We can stand on the shoulders of a giant that I personally would not have been able to become myself. I'm more like Friedrich Nietzsche. I'm weaker. You know, I'm physically weaker. I'm energetically weaker. My mind is really strong, but Carl Jung's accomplishment in many ways relied on not just his mind, but also his body in order to provide him like the support matrix, the professional and emotional, support matrix that was required for him to endure the appearance of the new philosophy. I feel like you just summarized a lot of really important things, and you didn't go into any details at all. But if somebody is willing to trust you based on the things that you're saying, then I think your summary of the big picture is quite accurate. Yeah, there's probably a lot more details about Jung and his life and the times he lived in and everything that could be filled in. But the main point is recognition that even just physical health, on top of the other aspects of his genius, his scholarship, his imaginative mind, his memory for visual images, and his capacity for scholarship, like his capacity for reading Greek, Latin, and just texts of all sorts at a sufficiently high speed that he was able to synthesize all of that information. All these things in one person. And he was like a large, physically healthy man, which meant he was attractive to women, like very attractive to women. And he had many women supporting him in his quest. And it's that kind of support that I think was needed in order to issue in this new way of thinking in a kind of peaceful way. And contrast that with Friedrich Nietzsche, who had no women, basically. He said the things and he thought the things, but it was kind of in a war-like way. There's almost no peace about the way Nietzsche was forced to say everything. Whereas Jung has a richness, a fullness about the things that he's saying that I think were made possible by his attractiveness to women. Because if you're attractive to women, then the women are around you. And if you're doing something serious, you're not just a playboy, but you're actually doing something serious, then those women are capable of supporting you and to just making you feel confident and like secure with yourself to the point where you can calmly and humbly express the divine message that was sent to you. Unlike Friedrich Nietzsche, who had to express the same things with such a huge amount of neuroticism. All right. Okay, so I guess that's another segment. So, section 2. Do you feel like 2 sections is enough? Yeah, 1 section was enough. We just threw in the Yoda of Depth Mysticism just for kicks, I guess. Okay, that'll do it for episode 37. We have some forum. If you feel like commenting, you can do so there. That being said, we'll see you next week.